What if the love that keeps your family together could put you in jail? For Kody Brown and his wives, that chilling query wasn't just television drama. It was a genuine courtroom fight that risked unraveling their lives. What if the same love that built your family might also kill it? That was the nagging question, looming over Kody Brown, patriarch of 18 children and husband of 4 women, whose life was exposed on the reality television show Sister Wives. Millions watched as his odd family arrangements unfolded on television. But what most viewers did not know was that, off-camera, the Browns were balancing precariously between family life and the law. From the moment the show premiered in 2010, curiosity and controversy swirled. For some, the Browns were a fascinating glimpse into a lifestyle shrouded in secrecy. For others, their open embrace of polygamy was a direct challenge to deeply held beliefs about marriage and morality. But no matter what side you were on, one thing was clear. This family was different. The Browns' home wasn't big. It was a village. 4 wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, shared their lives with Kody, and they collectively fathered a thriving crowd of children under one unorthodox roof. Their household brimmed with laughter, with chaos, and with the daily hassles of parenting on a grand scale. But beneath the gaiety of family meals and the soap operas of television, there was an underlying shadow, a law which saw their love as a crime. You see, in the state of Utah, where the Browns resided when the program started, the practice of polygamy was not only frowned upon, it was felony bigamy that carried prison time. For decades, the state had employed those statutes to terrorize and occasionally prosecute families who lived in plural unions. Although most presumed that those cases were few and only applied to extreme sex, Kody and his wives soon found that they too could become targets. It began softly, almost imperceptibly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Murmurs of investigation, queries into the living arrangements of the family, rumor that the county attorney was investigating their case. For the Browns, the glare of celebrity had rapidly transformed into a focusing glass, subjecting their personal decisions to public and legal scrutiny. Imagine the fear, waking up each day wondering if the knock at your door might be the police. Wondering if the family you'd built, the children you'd raised, could be torn apart in the name of a law that criminalized love. This wasn't about contracts, paperwork, or legal ceremonies. Kody was legally married to only one wife, Mary. The other relationships were religious unions, personal commitments of deep faith and trust. But to Utah prosecutors, that didn't count. For them, the Browns were a direct infringement on the state's anti-bigamy law. The unease in the Brown household became increasingly oppressive with each passing week. Kody and his wives would huddle around their large kitchen table, not talking only about household responsibilities or children's schedules, but the impending threat of lawsuits. The women fretted about their children being mocked at school, about the family being broken up. Kody, who bore the responsibility as the patriarch, grappled with the notion that his affection for his wives could be used as proof against him in a courtroom of law. Then came the moment of truth. Word that the county attorney in Utah was actually investigating their family. Suddenly, the Browns' fears were not paranoia, but reality. The family was confronted with the frightening possibility of charges, of arrests, of having their lives splashed on newspapers, not as reality television personalities, but as defendants in a criminal trial. For most families, the decision would have been easy. Step aside, cancel the show, retreat into the shadows. Not for Kody Brown, though. Rather than retreat, he took a daring step that would forever alter their lives, to fight back, but not in the shadows, but in the very courtroom in which the law sought to silence them. Before that battle could be launched, however, the Browns made a difficult choice. They loaded up their belongings, bid farewell to their Utah home, and ran across state lines to Las Vegas, Nevada. To outsiders, it seemed like just another relocation. But to the Browns, it was exile. A compelled flight from the community they had known, compelled by the fear of prosecution. Still, even in Nevada, the specter of Utah's law haunted them. The cameras kept rolling, capturing their new lives. But behind the cameras, The Browns were gearing up for a fight in the courts that would challenge not only their family, but the limits of freedom itself. This was no longer reality TV. This was reality, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have dreamed. The Browns were not struggling for the sake of glory, ratings, or popular sympathy. They were struggling for survival. They were struggling for the freedom to love as they wished, without shackles, without raids, without the fear that one day their children would witness their parents being led away in the back of a police vehicle. And so, as the gavel was about to come down in a Utah courtroom, the Browns' tale was changed. What had started as an experiment on television became a test case in the conflict between tradition, law, and freedom. It was a struggle that would ignite headlines, rouse controversy, and ask one of the strongest questions of all: should love ever be a crime? The relocation to Nevada was intended to be a respite. For the Brown family, it was like leaving Utah and crossing into safety. In Las Vegas, they would be able to breathe without the constant threat of law enforcement at their door. But safety, as they learned soon enough, was short-lived. The investigation in Utah still hung over them, and their very public lifestyle on sister wives ensured there could be no hiding. Initially, Las Vegas was free. The Browns leased houses, fell into new habits, and attempted to provide their kids with a new beginning. The glitter of the Strip felt like another planet in contrast to Utah's oppressive laws. But at night, after the children slept, the parents sat in the living room and discussed the storm that still lingered over their family. It was on one of those stressful nights that the possibility of a lawsuit came up. Kody had always been vocal about his right to live how he pleased. But now he wanted to do more than just talk. "We can't keep running," he said to his wives. "We have to fight, not just for us, but for every family like ours who lives in fear." The choice wasn't simple. Bringing suit entailed placing their deepest, most intimate assumptions in the brightest light possible: the courtroom. It entailed appearing before judges and attorneys who would deconstruct their marriages, their children, their religion. It entailed risking ridicule, not only from strangers, but from a whole judicial system that had made their lifestyle a crime for more than a century. But for the Browns, the decision was simple. They would no longer hide. They would fight. In 2011, the Browns instituted their lawsuit, Brown v. Beeman, against Utah's anti-bigamy law as unconstitutional. Not only was Kody at the center of the suit, but the issue at stake was whether consenting adults should be able to live in plural families without criminal prosecution. When the case made it into the courts, the air was charged. News networks throughout the nation clamored to report it. Headlines blared of the sister wives' lawsuit, and overnight, the Browns weren't merely TV stars. They were litigants in a case that promised to redefine how America perceived marriage. Within the courtroom, the theater was even greater. The lawyers for the Browns passionately claimed that Utah's statute was out of date, discriminatory, and an infringement on their constitutional rights of privacy and religious liberty. They clarified that Kody was lawfully married to one wife, Mary, but his other unions were spiritual marriages. There were not bogus marriage certificates, no misleading the government, only love, devotion, and devotion. But the state presented a different picture. To prosecutors, the Browns were not just innocent reality personalities. They belonged to a larger problem, one that the state said was linked to abuse, coercion, and exploitation in some polygamous groups. Utah's lawmakers said the law was needed to help shield women and children. The Browns, they said, were not exempt from the law just because cameras tagged along. For Kody and his wives, being in the courtroom was like something out of a dream. Marriages they had based on love, sacrifice, and faith were now being handled like a crime scene. Christine once explained how it felt like their souls were being put on trial. Janelle explained it was painful to listen to lawyers and judges argue over whether or not her love for her husband was criminal or valid. Even the kids felt the gravity of the proceedings. They weren't in court, but they were smart enough to know that their family was in danger. Some of them asked heartbreaking questions. Will they take Dad away? Or are we going to have to lie about who our family is? Those questions strengthened the Browns' resolve. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their kids' right to live without shame. The hearings went on forever, piling up legal arguments like bricks in a wall. Experts were produced, precedents quoted, and every aspect of the Browns' lives was examined. The courtroom was now a theater, and the Browns were both the performers and the defendants. But something amazing did happen with the case. The public viewed the Browns in a different light, rather than simply being that family from TV who practiced polygamy. The majority of viewers viewed them as parents, as individuals, as a family with insurmountable odds against them. You might disagree with their way of life, but it was difficult to keep from noticing the braveness involved in taking on an entire court system. As the case picked up steam, the Browns found they had ignited something larger than themselves. Fans from all over the country wrote letters of support. Civil liberties groups started to take notice. What had begun as an act of desperation to save one family was now a broader debate about freedom, rights, and government overreach into private life. Nevertheless, the pressure was constant. The Browns were criticized by both sides. Some conservative pundits accused them of attempting to legalize polygamy, while some ex-members of polygamous communities accused them of glossing over the dark aspects of the practice. It was a weighty load, but Kody and his wives stood firm. They had a clear message: we are not criminals. We are a family. By the time it came around to closing arguments, the Browns were drained. They had given their hearts, their tail, and everything on the line. The courtroom had transcended mere battlefields of courtly arguments. It was the forum where the Browns announced to the world that their love was not a crime. And with the Saints' gavel bringing their sessions to a close, one fact remained in the air. Win or lose, the Browns already had altered the dialogue. No longer could polygamy be marginalized as some sinister practice lurking in the Utah deserts. It was now on the front page, argued at homes, schools, and houses of worship nationwide. The Browns had placed their lives in the balance, and by doing so they compelled America to face a question it had long shunned. Should the government be able to dictate to adults with whom they may or may not fall in love? That question would not only determine the fate of their case, it would determine the legacy of their family's struggle. All courtroom fights have a turning point, when the momentum of argument, fact, and feeling crashes together to become something greater than the fight itself. For Kody Brown and his wives, their turning point arrived in late 2013, when a federal judge issued a decision that would shake the very foundations of Utah's polygamy laws, and leave an indelible mark on their unique story. But before that gavel came down, the Browns weathered a storm unlike any they ever experienced. As the case lingered, the world beyond the courtroom couldn't bear to look away. TV segments wrestled with whether the Browns were pathfinders for individual freedom or hazards of the kind that polygamy should never be legalized. Headlines shouted phrases like historic case, polygamy on trial, and reality TV meets the Constitution. It seemed the whole world had an opinion, from church elders to constitutional experts, from politicians to plain families sitting in their living rooms. For the Browns, it was both empowering and intimidating. On the one hand, they finally felt that their voices were finally being heard, that they weren't just another faceless plural family living in fear. On the other, the never-ending spotlight meant that every word that came out of their mouths, every step they took, was under the eye of millions. The wives reacted to the pressure differently. Mary, the initial wife, frequently bore the emotional burden of being Kody's sole legally married wife, an honor conferred with both privilege and loneliness. Janelle, level-headed and resolute, attempted to ground the family, prioritizing the stability of the children in the midst of turmoil. Christine, whose feelings tended to reside just beneath the surface, voiced the hurt of being condemned for the love she believed was sacred. And Robin, the youngest wife, grappled with feelings of guilt, asking herself whether becoming a part of the family had created more legal scrutiny. Kody, however, was carrying the greatest weight of all. As patriarch, the lawsuit had his name leading the charge. Brown v. Holman. He was the face of the case, the man the media wished to interrogate, the symbol prosecutors wished to assail. To him, the trial was not merely about laws and legal rights. It was about convincing the world, and his children, that the love of family they had was worth fighting for no matter what. The hearings uncovered a collision of values as old as America: freedom and tradition, personal freedom and social order. The lawyers for the Browns contended that the Constitution safeguarded their freedom to live as consenting adults free from criminal prosecution. Utah's delegates responded with tales of abuse, fraud, and exploitation associated with some polygamous groups, affirming that vigorous laws were essential to avoid injury. But then, in December 2013, the ruling was handed down, and it was explosive. U.S. District Court Judge Clark Waddups invalidated a cornerstone of Utah's polygamy law. Although bigamy was still illegal if one attempted to have more than one marriage license, the judge said it was unconstitutional to criminalize cohabitation, merely living under the same roof in a plural family, since bigamy was committed and nothing more than that. That is, families such as the Browns could no longer be labeled felons for simply dwelling together and referring to each other as husband and wife. The ruling sent shockwaves throughout the nation. For the Browns, it was a moment of victory. There were tears as they read the judgment, relief, and vindication. Kody described it as a victory for privacy, for family, and for love. His wives concurred, stating that finally, after years, they felt like their very existence was no longer at risk of criminalization. But its effect extended far beyond the Brown home. Throughout Utah and other states where there were plural families, the court decision was like a door creaking ajar. Families that had lived in terror felt slightly more secure. They had been hiding in the shadows for decades, keeping out of sight and concealing their existence from the public, fearing that a neighbor or a rival might turn them in. Now, for the first time, the law appeared to be on their side, at least partially. The ensuing media storm was fevered. Supporters hailed the ruling as a move toward genuine religious and individual freedom. Civil liberties organizations hailed it as a landmark decision, one upholding the principle that government must not intrude on the private lives of consenting adults. Critics were angry. Some were afraid that the ruling was the start of the legitimizing of polygamy as legal marriage. Others feared it would encourage abusive cults to ply their trade more openly. The Browns were at the epicenter of this cultural earthquake. Interviews deluged them. Cameras trailed their every step, and their tale became emblematic of a greater national argument. For the first time, the Browns were no longer merely reality television stars. They were activists, pioneers, and in the eyes of many, heroes. But even in triumph, the Browns understood the struggle was not yet won. The state of Utah immediately stated that it would appeal the decision. What tasted like liberty one day might be taken from them the next. Nonetheless, for that moment, the Browns cheered. They had appeared in court not knowing if they would be beat down, humiliated, or even criminalized once more. Instead, they emerged with a decision that legitimized their struggle and brought hope to millions of others. Christine would later call the moment a turning point in our souls. For years, she felt like she was living in secret, embarrassed by her plural marriage because society branded it as wrong. The court decision, she explained, gave her permission to stand taller, to believe that her love was not only worthwhile but should be honored, not ridiculed. For Janelle, the win wasn't about her personally. It was practical. We don't have to live in fear anymore, she said. That fear had so controlled so many of their choices, from relocating from Utah to what they revealed publicly. Now, despite challenges persisting, she felt a burden lift from her shoulders. The kids felt it too. Though they might not have realized all the technicalities of the law, they did know that their household had gained something significant. Their parents were not criminals. Their house was not illegal. That feeling of security was invaluable. Nevertheless, the Browns were chary of whooping too loudly. They understood that the appeals process would be protracted, convoluted, and unorthodox. But however the future turned out, they had etched out a triumph no one could undo. They had defied the law, and for a fleeting radiant instant, the law had warped to suit them. The milestone wasn't about winning a court case. It was about changing a national discourse. Polygamy had been cast in broad brushstrokes, dark, secretive, and equated with abuse, for years. The Browns' case compelled Americans to look at another side, families constructed on choice, religion, and commitment. As the dust settled on the ruling, one thing was certain: loved them or loathed them, the Browns had made history. And once changed, history can never be completely reversed. The battle in the courtroom was far from won, but the Browns had already done something colossal. They had demonstrated that despite centuries of legislation and crushing stigma, one family's strength could light a tipping point that would spread through a nation. Every great tale has its greatest moment, the moment when triumph seems assured, when the heroes are at their bravest. For the Brown family, that day was the 2013 federal court decision that overturned part of Utah's polygamy statute. For a time they lived with lighter hearts, their laughter a little freer, their walks less weighed down by fear. But history has a tendency to challenge even the greatest victories. And for Kody Brown and his wives, the victory they cheered was merely the eye of the storm. From the moment the ruling was made, Utah state officials made their intentions known. They were not going to take this loss lying down. To them, the ruling by Judge Waddups was an attack on decades of court tradition and state prerogative. The ink was hardly dry on the ruling before Utah's Attorney General appealed it, determined to reverse what the Browns regarded as a historic moment of justice. For the family, it was devastating. They had invested everything in this fight, laid out their personal lives for national examination, and were finally vindicated. Now that vindication was going to slip away from them. The appeals process would take months, years, to complete. Again, the family found itself in limbo, suspended between freedom and fear. The Browns tried to stay hopeful. Around their kitchen tables, they reminded each other that even if the ruling was overturned, their case had already sparked change. "We've started a conversation," Janelle said one night, her voice steady but weary. "Even if they reverse it, people are talking in ways they never did before." Christine nodded, although her eyes told a different story. "But what about us? What about our kids? Will they perceive us as criminals once more?" Those questions heavily burdened Kody. Being the head of the family, he not only bore the media pressure, but also the personal uncertainties of his wives and children. The appeals process was not merely a matter of arguments in court, it was a matter of faith, perseverance, and the capacity to continue going forward even if the odds were turned against them. The court proceedings on appeal were much less sensational than the initial trial, though hardly any less important. There were lawyers bickering about technicalities, about standing, about whether the Browns had even had the right to appeal their case in the first place. To the Browns, these issues seemed cold and impersonal, a world away from the passionate discussions of freedom and family that had previously dominated the courtroom. But that was the way appeals worked. They weren't about noble ideals or sentimental testimony. They were about process, about the small print of law, about whether the case could be slotted neatly into the narrow conduits of judicial precedent. Months passed and turned into years. And the Browns waited. And then in 2016 the ruling came down. And it was a blow. The 10th U.S. Court of Appeals overruled the decision of the lower court, not on the grounds that they disagreed with the rationale behind it, but because they held that the case was moot. At the time their desk received the appeal, the Utah County Attorney, who had threatened to prosecute the Browns in the past, had publicly announced that he would not charge consenting adult polygamists with anything unless there were other crimes involved. Because of that ruling, the judges held that the Browns were no longer credible threat of prosecution. Without the threat, the court held, the Browns had no standing to sue. In other words, their win was nullified, not because their case was incorrect, but because the court determined they no longer had a reason to struggle. For the Browns, it was as though being punched in the stomach. Decades of fear, sacrifice, and bravery had all come down to a technicality. They hadn't lost on the merits of their argument. They hadn't been informed that their love was a crime once more. But the law was still not changed. Utah's bigamy law stood, untainted and complete, as if their victorious fight never occurred. The disappointment was crushing. Christine dissolved into tears, declaring she felt as though the system had played a cruel joke on them. Mary, who had suffered so much public condemnation as the lawful wife, told it felt like being erased. Robin confessed she had questioned if becoming part of the family had meant more hurt than promise. Janelle, as reliable as ever, attempted to remind them that regardless of whether the law changed or not, the world had. "We can't measure our success only in legal rulings," she said. "We've changed hearts. We've opened eyes. That matters too." Kody, however, carried the heaviest burden. He had led his family into this fight, promising that they could stand up for their rights and make a difference. Now he felt the sting of defeat, the weight of knowing that the law had outmaneuvered them. Yet, even in disappointment, he refused to back down. "This isn't the end," he told his wives. "They can dismiss us. They can erase the ruling. But they can't erase the conversation. We've made history, whether they admit it or not." Outside the family, there was a division of opinion. Those who had supported the law were devastated, believing that justice had been reversed by a loophole. Opponents danced in the streets, claiming that the court had appropriately maintained Utah's right to police polygamy. Legal experts argued whether the decision was a measured use of precedent or a lost chance to settle a long-brewing contentious issue. For plural families around the nation, the reversal was especially bitter. Many had held out hopes that the Browns' case would be the key, that the tide was finally turning their way. Now that hope was less bright. Although the Browns themselves were secure from prosecution as a result of the county attorney's ruling, many other families were left in legal uncertainty. The message was unequivocal. The law was still on the books and its shadow still hung over them. But in a strange irony, the loss also stoked the Browns' legend. The simple fact that their case had gone so far, from county hearings to federal appeals, guaranteed that polygamy could no longer be disregarded or trivialized as a marginal issue. Their loss became part of the narrative. A reminder that forward never comes easily, that each step forward involves pushback. In the years that ensued, the Browns remained open about their lives lived before the television cameras, their struggles and victories shared with millions. They never again had to fear arrest as they had initially. But the wounds of the courtroom struggle lingered. It had taken a toll on them emotionally, financially, and spiritually. But it had also provided them with something invaluable: the understanding that they had stood, that they had not lived in silence, that they had resisted even when resistance seemed futile. The disappointment, though it hurt, became part of the power of their story. It testified to the fact that change does not arrive in one grand triumph, but in a series of fights, some won, some lost, that collectively reshaped the canvas of history. For the Browns, the decision was not the end of their struggle. It was a reminder that the road to freedom is long, tortuous, and frequently littered with disappointments. But it also served as a reminder, to them, at least, and to the world, that love, even the most unusual, has the ability to defy even the most powerful legislation. And as the dust settled from the Court of Appeals ruling, one truth stood: the Browns were not silenced. Their tale, in all its triumphs and failures, would continue to resonate far beyond the walls of any courtroom. Each courtroom struggle must come to an end. The gavel is brought down, the judges proceed to other cases, and the legal papers are stored away in dusty records. But there are cases that leave a resonance that resonates long after the courtroom doors have closed. In the case of Kody Brown and his wives, their courtroom battle against Utah's laws against polygamy might not have won them the all-encompassing triumph they had hoped for, but its impact continues to ripple through society, law, and culture today. The Brown family never aspired to be revolutionaries. When Sister Wives initially debuted, their mission was straightforward: to demonstrate to the world that a plural household could be functional, loving, and normal in its own right. They hoped to dispel stereotypes, to demonstrate that all polygamous homes weren't constructed around dishonesty, abuse, or control. But when the cameras started rolling, they were suddenly cast in a far larger role: that of activists, challengers, and symbols of a thorny cause. Their battle in the courtroom clarified that evolution. What had been a last-ditch effort to escape prosecution had become a widely followed lawsuit, questioning the boundaries of government authority over individual lives. Although the appeals court later rejected their suit, the Browns accomplished something much greater. They compelled a discussion that America had been sidestepping for years. Consider it. Prior to the Browns, polygamy had been depicted as dark and sensationalized. The term brought to mind images of cult-like compounds in the desert, of coercive marriages and abusive prophets. Those accounts were true, and they were worthy of note, but they were incomplete. By exposing their lives to the world, the Browns gave a different story, one of free will, faith, and shared commitment. Their case challenged others to wonder: must the law treat all polygamous households equally, or is there a distinction between coercion and consent? That question was perhaps not definitively answered in court, but it entered the public psyche. It was debated by law students in classrooms, It was debated on primetime talk shows. It was debated around dinner tables. By families, sometimes angrily. The Browns had pulled polygamy from obscurity into the public eye. And once there, it could never be fully erased again. Their struggle is the legacy of the changing trends that came with it. In 2020, years later after the case of the Browns, Utah enacted a law that lowered the penalty for consenting adults and the practice of polygamy from a felony to an infraction, more or less a traffic ticket. While short of full decriminalization, it was a significant symbolic change, indicating that society was starting to differentiate between coercive, harmful practices and those families who merely lived differently by choice. The Browns and their lawsuit were widely credited with making that happen, but the legacy wasn't just legal. It was also cultural. By their show, and by their court battle, the Browns forced viewers to examine their own stereotypes regarding marriage, family, and freedom. Some viewers left with increased respect for the family's bravery, even when they didn't condone their lifestyle. Others felt their own opinions on love and relationships expanded, seeing that happiness can be expressed in many ways. Obviously, the legacy was complex. The Browns themselves had internal problems that unfolded on camera: jealousies, breakups, and ultimately the failure of a number of Kody's marriages. By the mid-2020s, Christine, Janelle, and Mary had all exited Kody, with Robin remaining his sole still married wife. For critics, these personal problems were evidence plural marriage could not work. For fans, they were a reminder that all families, monogamous or plural, experience difficulties and heartache. But whether you viewed their saga as a warning or as inspiration, one thing was certain: the Browns had altered the dialogue forever. Kody himself once mused about their path with equal pride and melancholy. "We didn't win everything that we wanted," he admitted, "but we stood up. We didn't hide. And because of that, people see us, and they see other families like us." For the wives, the legacy was deeply personal. Mary often spoke about the loneliness of being the legal wife, but also about the strength it took to be part of such a public fight. Janelle saw their legal battle as proof that ordinary people can make a difference, saying, "We're not lawyers, we're not politicians, we're just a family. But we challenged the system, and in a way, we changed it." Christine, who eventually was happy outside of plural marriage, still recognized the significance of what they had accomplished as a group. "Though my journey has shifted, I'll always be proud that we stood up for what we believed in." And Robin, usually regarded as the most quiet, reminded the audience that their battle was one of dignity. "We just wanted to live without fear. Everyone deserves that." Their children as well bore the legacy. Born with the weight of both fame and scandal, they saw firsthand the price and the bravery of defying the law. A few accepted their family's struggle as a badge of honor. Some shrugged it off and sought quieter, less complicated lives. But whether they accepted it or not, none could deny that they had been part of something historical. The courtroom fight also made its impact on the legal community. Academics continue to quote Brown v. Bungman as an interesting case study in constitutional law, mootness doctrine, and the tensions of reconciling individual rights with state interests. Although the case did not provide a broad precedent, it pried open avenues for future challenges and generated arguments regarding the boundaries of marriage statutes in a society that values increasingly personal freedoms. And for the audience, the millions who heard the story on TV or read about the case in the paper, the Browns' tale became more than news. It was a mirror, reflecting even deeper questions about love and liberty and law. Do we think the government should regulate the personal lives of consenting adults? Do we understand family in terms of tradition, law, or love? These were the questions the Browns left behind. Questions that still linger long after the cameras cut off. Ultimately, the Browns' courtroom struggle's legacy lies not in codes of law or court decisions, but in people they reached and talk they started. They did not gain complete legal victory, but they gained something perhaps even more lasting: visibility. By coming out into the light, they put a face on a community that had long lived in the dark. By sharing their story, they compelled society to face inconvenient truths and re-examine long-standing assumptions. And that is the influence of legacy. It is not necessarily about victory or defeat. It is about effect. It is about the resonance that lingers long after the gavel drops. For Kody Brown and his wives, the courtroom wasn't merely a venue where laws were argued. It was a platform where they proclaimed their existence, their dignity, and their right to love. Their tale reminds us that victory can be found even in defeat, and that often the most significant changes are not the result of legal decisions, but the willingness to stand up and be witnessed. Thus, as we reflect on the Browns' court battle, one thing is certain: their legacy is not behind us. It endures in every argument regarding marriage, in every law re-examined, in every family that chooses to live honestly. Whether you agree with them or not, the Browns showed that love, unusual, complicated, and strongly defended, has the ability to knock over even the strongest walls of custom and law.